From a dusty corner of a darkened room, you spot a chest calling out for you. You shouldn't go, you need to stay. Please remember what the old folks say. You disregard, you shuffle fast. But one look inside may be your last. Mysteries abound, legends galore, terrifying creatures of nightmares and gore. It's all inside. The darkness grows. You've just walked into Realm of Shadows. It's John and Stacy's Realm of Shadows Patreon exclusive. And now, dear patrons, your host, John and Stacy Edwards. Hello and welcome to the Paranormal Sideshow Special Edition. I am your host, John Edwards, and joined as always by my lovely wife, Stacy.
Hello.
And what we are doing this week is bringing you a special Realm of Shadows preview. Realm of Shadows is obviously our interview show where we like to take a serious side to a topic and, it goes away from our normal way we might or might not, take on stuff. When we do the news each week, we like to put our own little views and have a bit of fun on the Paranormal Sideshow. So what we wanted to bring all of you for a couple of reasons is a preview of what Realm of Shadows is. Realm of Shadows is obviously our Patreon exclusive show that we have got started now. And it's just where we do an interview with someone. And like I said, we keep it more on the serious nature. We also wanted to bring this interview to you because it's so important to me. It's an interview that I've been wanting to do for a while, and I've actually had a lot of people come and send different communications. And we get emails all the time about a variety of topics, but one of those topics is, how do you get into ITC research? What is ITC? How, what's the best ghost box? You always talk about ghost boxes. You always talk about spirit boxes. What should I do to really get started?
Right. That
question resonates with me because I know that I went through a lot of trial and error myself, from misnaming things to using them incorrectly to not understanding enough. And it was a lot of trial and error. There was little to nothing out there to really explain any kind of way, how we're supposed to be doing this. Well, itcvoices.org is a website that I discovered a while back, and its founder, Tim Woolworth, happens to be a friend of mine on social media, where it's the end all be all of our relations. But, Tim is a very well-traveled, educated man that not only brews a good beer from what I hear, but has a love for animals and a passion for the paranormal. How could you beat that, right?
Right. I
wanted to get Tim. Tim has been gracious enough to give us some of his time for an interview. And what we're about to bring you now is going to be a Realm of Shadows type episode where we're going to be talking to someone that I respect in this field and really bring some, hopefully some interesting questions to Tim to help you better understand. And if you're already an expert on it and you already know everything about it, you're still going to learn something. I promise you. If you don't learn something, or at least
hear some really cool stories.
Yeah. If you don't learn something, we'll give you every penny back that you paid to listen to the show. So, it's a full money back guarantee, folks. How could you ever beat that?
That's right.
For more information on any of this and Realm of Shadows, be sure to go to paranormalsideshow.com. You can find everything from newsletters to Patreon information to our book, Till Death and Beyond. So without further ado, here's our interview with Tim Woolworth. All right, well, as promised, today we're going to dive into the world of ITC communication.
Interesting.
Yes, it is very interesting. I know
this is one of your favorites.
It's always been my favorite topic. Well, it's been my favorite topic. I shouldn't say always. That's, let's say for the last 10 years.
Since you were a babe.
Yeah, since I was just a babe. But as always, whenever we talk about a subject, I will take a quote from this man's website where there's no ghost box experts, but there are those with more ghost box experiences. So I wanted to find someone with more ghost box experience than I.
Right.
I, who in a documentary in 2010 misnamed, is that the right way to say that? Misnamed,
mislabeled.
Mislabeled. Thank you, Stacy.
There you go.
Mislabeled a Shack Hack is a Frank's box.
Oh.
So see, I've lost all credibility for the rest of the time.
I think we can be forgiving.
Yeah, well, nobody is. So, but speaking of that, today we have Tim Woolworth, and with a lifetime of interest in the paranormal, Tim has been investigating for around 2 decades. Along the way, he, like myself, was introduced to a Shack Hack ghost box. And the rest, as they say, is history. Tim had such an amazing session at Gettysburg in March 2010 that the very next month, he launched his itcvoices.org website. During that time, he has built a solid reputation in the field and has been featured on many TV and radio programs, with his articles shared around the world and by me on several occasions. In 2018, Tim also launched the paranormalstudy.com website, which is in many ways like the ITC Voices in the fact that I respect the very science of it all, and the fact that Tim has such a logical mind for things, doesn't really jump to the fantastic,
yes.
conclusions very often like I do. He's more your speed, but we're very, very happy to have Tim with us today. Tim?
Hey guys, it's been a long time coming.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yes, it has.
Absolutely. So I would be remiss without my first question being, if you could tell us a little bit, I'm sure I, just sort of scratched the surface there. If you could tell us a little bit more about yourself and really, what fueled that passion for that side, particularly of the paranormal research.
Well, ITC has always been my passion, but I branch out and I study so many other topics. But ITC is where I kind of laid my first footprints in the paranormal field. And it all started for me in beginning of summer 2008. I was at Rolling Hills Asylum, and I just joined this new team in New York. It was a new team to me. They'd been around for 7 years at that point. But I was at Rolling Hills, and we're in the Christmas room, which is no longer accessible, unfortunately. And they broke out this little gray box that was making so much noise, and I couldn't understand what this racket was all about. But I'm sitting there listening, and I had my recorder going, and then all of a sudden the racket just clears up for a second and says, Tim Woolworth. From that point, it just gripped me. So I found out how to hack that exact box, which was the 20-125. I still have the original box, and I use it frequently on investigations still. And it was just that one breakthrough communication that just dragged me right in. And for a while, when I was practicing with boxes, the leader of the group, she kept telling me, never do this stuff at home, never do this stuff at home. So I was very hamstrung. I was, naive. And I felt that I shouldn't do this stuff at home, but then I started to do it at home, and I started to record more and more and more and classify the recordings. And then, as you mentioned, that one communication I got in Gettysburg in March of 2010 in the monument on top of Little Round Top, the castle monument, if anybody's been there, it blew my mind. It was crystal clear communication using a Mini Box Plus. There was no radio interference whatsoever. And it was the first time that a crossing over session had been recorded for the world to hear. I had communicated with a couple of entities. I asked them about the light, and I got a reply that the light was everywhere. And then just words flew through me. I didn't know where they came from, but I said, look to those who surround me, my spirit guides. I now know them as texts. And then all of a sudden I got the words, they left, and then the voice came back and said, thank you. And it just blew my mind. And I remember, because I was in Gettysburg at the Phenomenology or Phenomenomicon, whatever it was, back in 2010. It did change names. I ran back to the Eisenhower hotel room after I'd listened to it on my PC with headphones. And when that was done, I went to the room where everyone was partying, and I just shut everybody up and said, you have to listen to this. And I played it as loud as I could. And I started the site a month later. And actually, Frank Sumption, who you mentioned earlier, there was one phrase in that clip that I couldn't understand because it was spoken at such a rapid clip, and it said far too long when I asked them how long they've been here, but it was said so rapidly it wasn't in the common tempo of a human voice. So I had sent that over to Frank, and he said, "Oh, it's far too long," because he'd been listening to this stuff for 8 years at that point.
Right.
And he's the one who helped me to parse that first major session that changed my life. And it's been for the better. Yeah, that's how I started.
Well, I mean, that's amazing. And it's also given me some chills, to be honest with you. When I first personally started with the Ghost Box, it was, like I said, the Shack Hack. And we did have some really good answers. I mean, on call and response, we were actually in a old bank building, and the bank building was in downtown Kingsport, Tennessee, and had a basement that was very dark. People were scared to go down there. Had 3 stories other than that. And I ended up getting I was going through a very hard time in my life personally, and things that were coming across from this Ghost Box was actually very personal. It was very biting in many ways. And it wasn't, I wouldn't say it was evil or anything, but it was really talking about people in my life, or short burst of referencing things that was just absolutely spot on. And that wasn't what I was trying to get. I was asking for, spirits at the location and whatnot. But because of that, it made me as well take this communication to home and do things I shouldn't have done. And that leads me to my next story, or my next question, I should say. You mentioned, being bullheaded or whatever, going and trying this at home. I kind of know where you may be leading with this, maybe not, but what's your thoughts on people who, because let's face it, this is real-time communication. There is a certain sexiness to it, as opposed to anyone who has taken 19 recorders out to a Waverly Hills and recorded for 20 hours and spent the next 6 months trying to listen for a sniffle. So there is a certain thing about this. So what is your thoughts personally on that, taking it home, doing the sessions there at the house, and really as far as diving so deep into it?
Well, first of all, when you're doing sessions at home, it allows you to do a session whenever you want. And that is of paramount importance, because if you are one of the people who just practice in the field, you're going to miss out on a lot of communication. As an ITC historian, I look back at how ITC has been performed since 1957, when the first EVP was recorded, or 1959, when the first methodology for EVP had been established by Jurgensen. EVP was basically the first form of real ITC, and it had been practiced at home by everybody. You're looking at Jurgensen, you're looking at Radova, you're looking at Sarah Estep, Tom Butler. All of these mavens of paranormal research did EVP at home. Then EVP became a more popular thing in the 80s for ghost hunting purposes. And obviously, when you're ghost hunting, you are trying to reach out to an unseen force. So the fear started to develop, the fear that you bring these unseen forces into your home. And that leads us to where we are today with modern audio ITC, whether it be via software, via a phone application, or via a traditional ghost box. Frank practiced at home. He invented the ghost box. I've been practicing at home since 2009. And many other researchers in the field are doing sessions at home. That being said, when you do work at home, or when you do any paranormal work, let's just broaden it out, any paranormal work, you are basically invoking the other side. You are asking them to communicate with you. Now, one of the big misconceptions in the paranormal field is that we have some kind of control over the other side. You've got these people who will go to, for example, Waverly Hills, and then when they leave, they say something like, "I command you by Archangel Michael, no ghost can follow me home." Good luck with that. We have no control over the spirit world. Spirits find us interesting. They stick with us for a while. That happens. Most of the time, it's exceptionally benign. I mean, you could be walking through a Walmart and there could be a spirit there that finds you interesting. We have no control over that. That being said, when you start using a ghost box on a regular basis to communicate, you are talking to some kind of disincarnate consciousness, which may or may not belong to a ghost. We can get into that later. But you're talking to some form of entity that has agency. And sometimes that agency wants to continue to communicate with you. And you can't stop it. You can tear the veil to the other side, but you can't always sew it back up. And that is something that every paranormal investigator needs to keep in the back of their mind. For me, I know that by using these boxes at home for a decade now, things happen. There are shadow people, there are things that are knocked off shelves, there's knocking, there's footsteps. It's par for the course. It doesn't bother me. Right. Other people, that may bother immensely, and more importantly, it may not bother the person itself. But when you're doing it at home, you also have to consider if you have a partner or children. If you want to be able to live in a house where this activity can be brought up when you have other people living there with you, that's a choice you're not only making for yourself, but for other people as well.
Right. Yeah, and I agree wholeheartedly there. You know, you mentioned about maybe we don't know exactly who we are talking to. It could be a spirit. It could be, some sort of ghost. I know on your website, which I have read, immensely since finding it a while ago, a very long while ago. And it's always been very interesting to me because many of our schools of thought are the same. And I can only imagine that comes from a lot of use of the boxes and really diving into it, because people that I've spoke with in the past who actually do communicate using some form of ITC, and I'm talking communicate a lot in controlled situations and, really take it seriously. I've noticed a lot of the same schools of thought there, when it's not the fraudulent ones or whatever. But speaking of that, with who we are talking to, I found that very curious. One of the more interesting facts, because, I've had personally voices that sounded like one of my people on my team, that sounded like Stacy before that I've heard. I've had voices that sounded like a past loved one that had, recently been deceased. So I've had both of those. I've not had anything more on the extraterrestrial side that I know of. And it could all be a demon, you really don't know. So I know on there you have 3 schools of thought that are listed, which, you're speaking with the dead, the living, or, or some sort of thought, press of the living, because God knows we don't know how powerful our own minds are. And the extraterrestrial question. So, I was going to see if you could expand on that. And beforehand, I just wanted you to know that I absolutely have had the conversation as far back as 10 years ago about, are we actually influencing? And it even goes for EVP. Sometimes when I have asked questions and I'm so intent, you're sitting in that floor in that old building, in that old house, and you want this answer so bad. And all of a sudden you get this answer, you get the, a simple yes, or you get something more spectacular than that. I've had to wonder, are we impressing our own thoughts onto this many times? But, I'll let you take it from there.
Well, as for the idea of impressing thoughts, I have to hearken back to Friedrich Jürgensen, The first few EVPs that he recorded in his cabin in Sweden, he actually thought that he was impressing upon the magnetic tape his thoughts through psychokinesis. One of the paramount theories of EVP formation, as laid out by association transcommunication, is the PK hypothesis, where we can influence the outcome on the recording. So PK is one of those things that has always been there as a consideration in the background. More importantly, PK can manifest in physical form. You may be familiar with the concept of the tulpa in Buddhism, which is where an individual, through concentration, meditation, and just general dedicated thought, can make their thought a reality. The same thing happens in magic, for example, like sigil magic and chaos magic. You make a thought into reality. You can do groupthink, where several people create a reality out of a thought that they're all doing at the same time. This is done in occultism. It's called an egregore. And more importantly, it's been also demonstrated in the paranormal field with the Phillip Experiment that was done by the Toronto Parapsychological Society. This is a very famous experiment that I'm sure a lot of your listeners are familiar with. But for those who aren't, there was a table of researchers, all part of the Parapsychological Society. And what they did is they created a medieval character named Philip. They ascribed a bunch of things to him, very specific moments in his life. It was all laid out. Everybody thought upon Philip, and then they started to do seances based upon Philip. And over the years, all of a sudden, with seances, they'd start to get taps for yes on certain questions that aligned with his life. Questions that did not align with his life, the questions that they came up with on the spot, questions that were not part of his original life story, there would be no response. Eventually, the table started to tilt for yeses, and the experiment was called to a close when the table chased one of the seance sitters around the room. That was a thought form that was created by a group, and it's made manifest. So as demonstrated, we've already thought that PK can happen with EVP. We know it can happen in other forms of paranormal. So now let's look at how a thought form may influence ITC. You said that, you sit there and you want an answer to happen so bad, and it happens. So you get that yes, you get that third knock, etc. Are we creating these things? Well, on my site, ITC Voices, I have demonstrated that living voices come through in 3 different fashions. The first time it happened to me was in 2010. My ex-roommate in Hollywood, we used to work the same job together. He was living in Hollywood. I was living back in New York. And it was about 2 in the morning my time. I hadn't spoken to him in a very long time, but I still had his email. And when I reviewed the session, in his voice, it came through with the word Timmy, which is how he always used to refer to me because, we were roommates in the 90s. South Park came out. You have Wheelchair Boy, and he always used to say Timmy just like that. And then the word Karina. And I was really shocked by that. So I sent him the clip, and then he called me up, and I had to explain to him what ghost boxes were and what I was doing with my life, and et cetera. And he was blown away because he's like, that's my voice. And it just said Karina. And I'm like, yeah, what does Karina mean? Well, he had met Karina 2 weeks before, and he's still with her today, 9 years later. And the cool part was he was dreaming at the time. He was asleep. He had no recollection of the dream of contacting me or anything like that, but he was definitely in a sleep state when that happened. So we know that. Oh, and also I had him record the words Timmy and Karina, and you can listen to an AV comparison on the site. So we know that you can impart information in a dream state that is unknown to the listener. That is really cool. On a second occasion, I had another voice of someone I knew come through. It was clear as day on a Frank's box, and it just said, "Hey, Tim." And that "Hey, Tim" just resonated with me so much because it sounded so much like her voice. No compression, anything. It was just, it was her voice. So I contacted her the next day, and she's like, "Oh, yeah, I'm practicing lucid dreaming right now." And once again, I was doing it in the middle of the night. She was asleep.
Wow.
I had her record her voice, and then I ran it through a spectrogram versus the spectrogram of the recording through the Frank's box, and the frequency groupings are the same. Now, what blows my mind when I think about that is when we produce a voice, we are basically taking air, pushing it up, the diaphragm's pushing it up through our lungs, out our trachea, and vibrating our vocal cords. All of us have unique vocal cord vibrations. So for her voice to come through a Frank's box and the frequency spectrum matches up, that blows my mind, because that says that somehow the communication that's coming through that box is actually coming through a physical being, a physical mechanism of some sort. I'm still baffled by it. And that spectrogram's comparisons on the site as well. And the third time, which demonstrates that PK can definitely happen, my old mentor, Stacy Jones, who's been in the field for 30 years, we were sitting at a table in an old funeral home, and I had that 20-125 shack hack going. I had a recorder on the table, and we're sitting there doing the session, and then I go back and I review it, and my mind was absolutely blown. I sent over the clip to Stacy, and basically you hear a couple, tidbits of it scanning through the station, and you hear her voice saying so clearly, in a way, it's pissing me off. And right after that, Stacy, the physical Stacy, talks, trying to figure out what it just said. So you can hear her voice coming through the radio, and then her physical voice right afterwards is a comparison, and it's the same voice. So she was in the room with the ghost box, somehow impacting the ghost box with a disincarnate consciousness. So her voice is coming through while her physical form is right next to me.
Wow.
That's crazy.
No, that's amazing. Actually, I mean, absolutely amazing.
It is.
And it just makes you think, I mean, of course, that is why it is the paranormal, I would suspect,
It makes me wonder, when the ghost box thing, and it's all relating to paranormal investigating, you have a lot of investigators that say that they like to investigate at night because it's easier to get the evidence. But if there are more people asleep at that time and, putting their thought forms out there, and that's one of the reasons you're getting some of this stuff, then that would make sense.
That could be very valid. I hadn't actually considered that point before. Yeah, very interesting.
It was funny you talk about the Phillip Experiment as well. So we have some weird friends, and he will laugh when he hears this, but we have he calls himself the caretaker. He's got a real name, but he's very into martial arts. When I say very into, he has some ancient swords that were handed to him by people. He's done other stuff. Anyway, he's got a fully functioning, accredited, I guess you would say accredited in that field.
I don't know the term.
It's official Shinto shrine. And it just so happens to be in East Tennessee, and it's hidden, and we call it the compound, and it's amazing. The things he has there. He introduced us to the world of Oni and just a lot of magical things. He's got a table there that took forever to build. You can't move it. It's so heavy, but it has every possible thing you should not have all in one table. I'll actually have to I'm going to have to introduce this to you with pictures and videos, because you offline, you will love this personally.
Right.
But he loved our show, our old show, our first show, Haunted South. And so he wanted to bring Haunted South to a studio. He had done TV work and everything. So we were at the time at a local television access studios where we did Haunted South, but then he built a studio for us in his home. And in in this shrine, in this place that had all this magic and gateways, and Home and Garden TV wants to come to his house just to film like some of the fountains and these tubs and things with skulls in the ceiling, all this weird stuff. So we went there and we did our weekly podcast, but we did it on YouTube there and blah, blah, blah. But one thing I always wanted to do, because of the old Afterlife Investigations show documentary that everybody has seen, I always wanted to do my own skull experiment. So we got a bunch of psychics and alleged psychics and people that had once met a psychic and a skeptic and people like that, and we set them around same time every week and in the dark in this known haunted place where everything was okay to come through, and we just started doing things because my big thing was I wanted a newspaper from like 1930 to drop, or some undeveloped film to have something on it, that kind of thing. So we did it for a while, but honestly, things got pretty heavy in our personal life, and there was one person that was doing it that had less than
honorable intentions.
Yes,
we should say. Yeah.
So he really practiced more on the darker side. So anyway, we kind of exited stage left, and they got rid of him, but they have kept doing this thing that we began, and I was interested to find out. We recently moved from the Northeast back to the South, and I got contacted by my friend, and he said they have continued doing this every week at the same time, nonstop, for 5 years. And they have had amazing results. And I've actually got to hear some of this, but it's to the point now where there's, objects move, there's physical manipulation, there is, instant answers, there's names for people, there is, and they don't look at it as bad. They look at it as a positive interaction. But I just thought that was very interesting because you brought up something I don't hear brought up very much that I actually love. But just so you know, there are other people out there that are that are still that crazy. So
yeah, and you've got to hand it to people who are willing to dedicate years of their time to a single experiment, because that's how progress is made. The skull experiment still goes down as one of the greatest experiment groups of all time, and Robin Foy still writes a lot on skull experiment, and if you haven't been following his work, you might want to look into it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I have not followed it. That entire documentary had such an effect on me, from everything from the audio communication on. I just thought it was great, and I always introduced other people to it.
So let me ask you, I just want your opinion on this. And since we don't really, John and I, we are more on the paranormal investigating side while also using, the ITC stuff. And we are not just solely ITC. We happen to notice, though, on our investigations that, sometimes certain people, when they're in the room, will get more of an interaction with the device than other people. Me, for instance, it's not something that I'm very good at, I guess. I don't know if you can be good at that. It seems like when I'm around it, I tend to just get really sleepy, and I don't get a lot of actual answers or communication. But now when John is in there, it's very active, for the most part. And we've noticed that with other people too. There are other people that will come around and can get a lot of good interaction, and then there are people that can't. So do you feel, in your opinion, that there is something about us personally that allows us to have this easier communication with, like an ITC device?
Absolutely. I don't know what the magical formula is to have better interaction via ITC. For me, I've had, astounding communication since the very beginning. And I don't know why. Maybe it's because of an open mind or a lifetime of study or dying as an infant. I don't know. But what I have seen physically to demonstrate this point, I remember using a mini box plus at a library fundraiser. There were about 40 people present, and at the end of the night, they were all cloistered around me as I was doing a session. And I normally only do 10-minute sessions, but when I'm doing a large group session, typically loved ones from the other side like to come through for people who are in the room. So I'll continue to relay the messages and, for as long as it needs to. And this night was just popping. And loved one after loved one after loved one was coming through, and there was a lot of closure happening. And when I do these sessions, it is physically exhausting. I don't know why. I've practiced automatic writing most of my life, and when the boxes that I use, I with the exception of a shack hack, but I do hold it. The boxes that I use usually have a sensitivity or a sweep rate knob on it. And I go into kind of a mini trance, and I let them control my right hand, which controls the sensitivity knob, much like automatic writing. I've done that since day one, so they are tuning the communication to help it come through better. I also think in this mini trance, it allows me to communicate with them better. So doing this session, that one session in the library, I've been doing this for almost 2 hours at this point. No one wanted to leave because they're all waiting to hear from the next person to come through. Finally, I just said, I can't do this anymore. And the person next to me is like, I've always wanted to use your box. Can I use your box? And I was like, yeah, sure. So I handed it off to him, and it went from crystal clear communication to nothing but static. He got nothing. Not even radio. And it was just from transferring from one hand to the next.
Yes. Yeah. That's really interesting. And I've always thought that people that were more open or more sensitive maybe would probably have a better success rate with something like that.
Yeah, and it's not just ITC. There are people out there who gravitate towards a piece of equipment, and the more that they work with it, the better the communication they get. There are some people who get amazing EVPs. There's some people who can use a very expensive word generator and get like an Ovilus and get words that actually match up with the environment where other people can't. I don't know how they decide to communicate, but they do communicate. And typically it's with those of us who've been in the field longer. There's a concept that was put out by the guy who coined the term instrumental transcommunication, Ernst Senkowski. He called it a contact field. A contact field is basically everyone on the other side. So it's your friends, it's your family, it's your ancestors. It's also all these spirits who've ever found you interesting. It's every spirit you've come across ghost hunting over all the years, every house you've been in, every sanitarium, every jail. There's a lot of communication out there waiting to happen. That's called a contact field. So the longer you've been in this field, the easier communication should become for you.
Yeah, no, I agree that is the case. We have this joke whenever John and I would investigate with a team before it was just us that did the investigating. There was always this joke that John was always the one that got all the audio evidence, and if you wanted to hear something or whatever, you would go with John, wherever he was going. But, and, that building he was talking about, that bank building that he was referring to when he was telling about the communication he got, we had another experience there where we were in the basement, and there was a bunch of people with us, and we had all these K2 meters, and we don't normally use K2 meters as a general rule, but we had a bunch.
It was a long time ago.
Yeah, it was a long time ago. We had a bunch, and we were using them for basically for trying to get yes and no answers from them, even though we know they can be easily manipulated. But it was a very strange thing because John had one in his hand that was working, and we would ask questions, and it would go up, and there were two other ones in the room that did not do anything. And we also had a skeptic there, and boy, he was fun. And he said, well, it's just your K2 meter. It's broken. And John's like, well, maybe, he's open to every interpretation. And so he switched his with somebody else's in the room, and still the one that he was holding is the one that went off and not the other two, even though they had traded. And so then he just took all three K2 meters and put them in his hands, and all of them would go off at the same time, even though they hadn't been going off for anybody else. And then he would specifically say, can you make the one in the middle light up? And like the one in the middle would light up. It was very strange. It was very strange, but
Yeah.
It would go all the way to red on the one in the middle, and the other two wouldn't even register anything. And then the one on the right, and I told him, I said, if we're manipulating this and we're faking this with our phones, which, unfortunately K2 meters are notorious for, it would be impossible. It would be literally impossible to duplicate this, even in a controlled situation. And, because they were all touching. They were all three touching in the one I was asking for. So, as far as paranormal goes, that's that's where that holy grail, you really love those pieces. And it's funny that's a great segue, Stacy. I was going to ask you, because all researchers have it. All researchers have their go-to evidence. Their go-to, this is what I want you to listen to first, Mr. Novice. What would it be for Tim? What is your, maybe it's not even something you've captured yourself, but I'm more on things you have done yourself. What is your one piece of evidence that really moves you? That's a paradigm shifting kind of moment for people, but is just spectacular. Like, what would that be off the top of your head?
Well, the thing that always I gravitate towards is that session in Gettysburg. And when I put it in lectures, because I talk about the light and whatnot, and from that session in Gettysburg, I actually developed a method for crossing over any entity that asks for help. One of the things that has always happened in ITC, whether it be EVP or whether it be ghost boxes, we've always had these voices asking for help. And most people, they had no idea what it was about. It's just like, oh, another thing for help, another thing for help. So after this session I did in Gettysburg, I developed a methodology, and I published that methodology. And people around the world started using this methodology, and they all started to achieve the same result. So I make a big point in some of my lectures on ITC about the crossing over section and light and all that jazz. All depends on the nature of the lecture, obviously. But when I always build to this particular clip, and then I'll show the audio, and I'll break it out on the screen so you can read what's happening as it's happening, because this was pre-video for me back in 2010. And you just watch people and their faces when they see it. And when the little boy says the lights are everywhere, and he comes back and says he was, and I say, you were what? And he says, saved. And when that word saved comes through, what you can see on people's faces makes this everything I've ever done worthwhile, because they realize that there is power in communication with the other side, and you can be more than just a third-party observer. You can actually help people out.
Absolutely. Which that is extremely moving, and I'm going to share one with you that I still have the audio clips from. Obviously, it was 2011. We were asked to come into a functioning theater. And we've done a lot of stage theaters. For some reason, I even put an article about it. But this was an actual movie theater, and it was functioning. I mean, there was 7 theaters in this place, and they were having so much evidence, and there was seats being ripped up. I mean, in front of people, and it was very violent. But anyway, we went there, and I got some of my best evidence. This was one of those places where you actually get the evidence that creates your theories that guides your career. I call it a career, but guides your research.
Right.
And honestly, out of this place, it really gave me a word that I use for to this day. And there's one of the chapters in the book is called the keeper theory, because I had this theory that I was already developing it, but that there's one controlling entity in a lot of locations I go to that will shut down communication. And, I know a lot of people say, well, the ghosts are tuckered out, or they've used all their energy, or whatever. Maybe that's true. But in my experience, sometimes I would be getting wonderful communication with little Timmy. No correlation to Tim. But
or was it?
But all of a sudden it would shut down completely. Nothing. And, every now and then when that would happen, I would get some audio evidence that would be literally saying, shut up, or, something to that regard. And this happened in this theater. And I was like, there's nobody that's going to stop you. There's nobody that's going to harm you, which I shouldn't have been that presumptuous, but I said, there's nobody that's going to harm you for talking to us. And I got an answer back, Class A. It says the keeper will. Now, it might not have anything to do with anything that what I'm talking about, but the keeper was such a scary term for me that I adopted it for that. I was going to ask you, even though it's not the same as what we're talking about, sort of in the same ballpark because it's paranormal, have you come into contact yourself with everything going cold because maybe there is a controlling spirit in a location, and also that versus the fact of energy being involved and how well they're communicating or how much they can come across?
Well, first, I hate the word energy because it's so ephemeral. We can't define the word energy. It's like modern agers throwing around the word quantum for everything. So I try to avoid terms like energy unless absolutely necessary. But more to your point, I have. It often happens with children because when a child starts to come through, there's usually another entity that will tell them to be quiet or they can't talk. I don't know why this is, but it is very apparent. There's only been a couple of locations where I've gotten more than one child to speak. And, well, one of them is like Post Town, a school. It's a perfect location, and you had all the deaths right there with the children. But I've had multiple children speaking there. Other locations, like Fort Ontario, there was a kid there who had polio. He was an officer's son, and he still shows up at my sessions today. But when I first made contact with him, I used to go to the fort all the time. I actually grew up 2 blocks from there, and one of my old team members had a key so we could go hunt there whenever we wanted. And I started to establish a rapport with this kid. But at the very beginning, there was a woman who would say, he can't speak, don't talk, be quiet, things like that. Nothing like the keeper, though. But when it comes to a session drying up, that happens quite frequently, where you'll get words like done, just key terms that tell me that they've relayed all that they can. It's rare, though. More often, when I end a session, I tell them I'm going to hang up, and then I give them a countdown of 3, 2, 1, and then I say goodbye, and then I let it linger for about 5 seconds, then I shut it down. Over the years, with my countdown, because I have a contact field, I will say I'm going to say goodbye now, and before I get to 3, they'll often say no, stay, things like that. They want the communication to continue rather than shut down. So sometimes I'll let it linger for a while, ask a few more questions, then shut it down.
I love that.
But then when I give my countdown a 3, 2, 1. More often than not, when I say 3, they'll either say 3 or 2 right after me, and they count down with me. And at the end of after 1, they'll say goodbye right before I say goodbye. It's amazing to see, and I've been blessed because this is what I've done since day one. I've always thought that, I'm talking with an entity like a human, I'm addressing a consciousness like I would address a human in front of me. And on a telephone, you just don't hang it up without saying goodbye. And I've always felt that was showing respect for the other side, to tell them that, I'm going to be pulling away rather than continuing to engage them. And over the years, they continue just by giving me the countdown themselves and saying goodbye. And in all the paranormal events that I've done, the conferences, etc., every time that I do this on a hunt afterwards, it invariably happens with the countdown. And to watch the people's faces when that happens, because that just kind of cements that it's real-time communication with a consciousness that wants to communicate with you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's crazy. I have this interesting story, and it's going to kind of lead to a question. But we used to go to this location here in Virginia called Major Grand Mansion, and we had a lot of investigations there. We spent a lot of time there, and for a while we were doing, the public thing where people would come and we would, take them around and sort of show them about paranormal investigating. And on one occasion, we had this public group in, I would say about, what would you say, like 20 people, something like that. And we were downstairs in the basement, and John was showing them our SB7, spirit box with the spirit gear attached, and was explaining how it worked with the radio sweep and that sort of thing. And he made this joke about how sometimes that it's not something that would come across on the radio because occasionally there are curse words that will come through in the communication. Now, at the time, I was recording with my digital recorder because we started making a habit of using the digital recorder every time we used the SB7 because we would get EVPs outside of what was coming through the device. And we got this amazing EVP. It's one of my favorites. It's so clear. After he said that about the curse words, we have an EVP of a spirit saying, he said we curse. Kind of like it was offended that he would even suggest that sort of thing would happen. So I'm curious if you've ever had any of your sessions recorded in a way that you've noticed other like EVP kind of activity around what's happening.
Oh, absolutely. That happens all the time. And a lot of the videos that I put up, I will put EVP in bracket afterwards to discriminate it from a ghost box communication. Now, the reason why this happens goes back to the very fundamentals of instrumental transcommunication. For that, we go back to Jurgensen. When Friedrich Jurgensen was recording bird songs for a documentary he was doing, and he recorded the words, "Friedel, you're being observed," he noted that the sound of the voice, he wrote, sounded like it was carried by the wind and the leaves. There was that rustling sound. And he continued to do this. And when he finally left the cabinet and went back to his normal house, he wanted to try to establish the conditions that the voice was first recorded at. And he couldn't do that because he didn't have a forest outside of his window. He lived in a city. So what he did is he brought in white noise. He did this by tuning to an interfrequency, which is that between two radio stations.
Right.
There's no broadcast. So actually, as a side note, to this day in Europe, frequency 1485 is still known as the Jurgensen frequency.
Wow.
Which is really cool, by the way.
Yes.
So he introduced radio static in the background, and he found that voices popped out. They rode on the static and just became louder. So Konstantin Radova went to Sweden, learned the techniques for recording EVP, brought it back to Germany, wrote the book Breakthrough. He used radio static, and he also, because he was a scientist, he was a trained psychologist. He trained under Carl Jung. He had a lot of science friends, and one of his friends was a physicist. So his physicist friend came up with what is now known as the Radova diode, where it's basically, in ham radio parlance, it's called a cat's whisker, where there's basically a little germanium diode with a little wire sticking off of it, and it gets connected into the antenna of a radio. So that germanium diode basically gives a short burst of white noise, and that antenna would be hooked into a reel-to-reel recorder, and that white noise would be there on one channel, and the voices would be recorded on another. And it worked wonderfully. When EVP came to America with Sarah Estep, she did the same thing. She used white noise as a methodology. So let's jump forward 40 years. Here in 2019, we're talking about ghost boxes with EVPs riding over them. What do ghost boxes create? White noise.
Right.
Right.
And for those who don't know what white noise is, basically, the human ear can hear from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. That's 20,000 frequencies per second. When you play thousands of these together, you get that interfrequency, that in the background. That is white noise. And it's been a fundamental part of EVP and ITC since day one. A lot of people will, I get asked this a lot. They say, well, what about my digital recorder? I can put down my digital recorder and be able to record anything. And what they don't realize is that digital recorders have integrated circuits in them. Integrated circuits are inherently noisy, but guess what? There's filters built in, so you will never hear that noise on your recording, but it's there. That noise is in the background generating. And there are people out there who are using ITC devices like portals and whatnot that are basically tamping down on all the noise. And it's basically ghost boxes have moved backwards since the portal came through, but it's easier for people to listen to. And there are other people who say you don't need white noise at all, and that is just not true. And these are the same people using software where, once again, you have a computer, you have computer fan noise, you've got IC, all that stuff going in the background. I penned a theory a while back on how ITC actually happens, especially with ghost boxes. So we have this white noise going on. And this theory came to me. I was just thinking one day, just meditating on how communication happens. And it came to me visually of a voice speaking and then frequencies matching up, and the word stochastic resonance. So I looked up stochastic resonance immediately. And basically what it is when you have a frequency, let's call it the voice of the other side. They want to communicate with us. That voice has a base frequency and harmonics and octaves and everything else. It can take, 200 to 2,000 frequencies to make a voice. Now, when you have all those frequencies coming through, and however they're projecting it, and there's different thoughts on how they project it, whether it's projected physically with the voice, like I was speaking earlier with the vibration of the vocal cords on that one sample, or like Suzanne Max Getting, who was a channeler who said that in the future, in future times, the entities will be projecting communication like a radio, and will be received like a radio in the future. I can't remember the exact quote off the top of my head, but that's basically what it says. So we have our voice, the voices of the other side coming through in hundreds to thousands of frequencies. You have this white noise that's going on in the background, and you have a threshold. So the threshold is where basically the white noise and the noise of the voice match up. And where they match up, the threshold, that carrier wave that goes through, the sound becomes much louder because the noise carries the voice. Think of a bumblebee. You've got this bumblebee just around. You can hear it, a couple feet away, no problem. But a hive you can hear from several meters away because all those wings are beating at the same frequency, and it becomes so much louder. That is what stochastic resonance is in audio. So when you have the white noise going on in ITC or EVP or any form of audio recording of the anomalous, the communication that comes through, the frequencies match up, and it passes a threshold of decibelage to where we can actually hear it through our equipment. When you think of, back before ghost boxes and you're doing EVP, how do most of the EVPs come through? A whisper. Because it could barely break through the noise threshold.
Absolutely.
But now we've got these loud boxes that are designed to carry line level audio very loudly. It's much easier to come through and for communication to manifest in several different forms.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's fantastic. One thing interesting that you were talking about obviously was with the white noise. Now this is going to be a little bit of just personal experience, and it could just be pareidolia on my part. But there has been in the past probably just a handful of instances like this. But one in particular, I remember we were making a documentary, and during this, we're going through, we have so many different versions of the same audio. We have our our recorders, we have the camera audio, we have the, this is where I started using the boom mic back then and turning the gain way up and really getting some great real-time communication as well that way. But there's this one time that I think of where I had a partner of mine in the other room, and we were investigating a large building, and he had said something in the other room. I'm asking a question in, let's just say, room A, and room B is down the hallway. I'm asking a question, and I get an exact answer. I don't remember the exact question or answer, but let's just say, what's my name? John. I get the exact answer. So when I'm going through this, I'm like, wow, that's awesome. And I send it to everybody. And so they go through the camera audio to their credit and match it up timestamp wise. And it actually was Tim, one of our partners, that was in the other room saying something pretty low, but it had picked up throughout going down the hallway, had picked up on my recorder. And obviously I didn't hear it real time, like in my own ears, or I was just too intent on what I was doing to really pick it up. But at that time I was like, well, I remember this. I was like, let me ask you guys, because they may or not have been razzing me a little bit. But I was like, why is it, or who's to say that if they can't manipulate white noise, that why could they not manipulate human voice its own way? Because they don't have, you talked about earlier actually having the diaphragm and all that. I was like, why could they not manipulate the sound waves that were coming to give me the answer that I needed at that time? That's really far-fetched. And of course that would, skeptic wise, they would put me over the hot coals. But what's your thoughts on that?
Well, that is a known phenomenon that's happened for centuries. It's called voice transfiguration. It used to happen and still happens today with transmediumship, where a voice will overtake another person and they can physically speak a different voice through a person. It's happened in cases of possession. It happens in cases of poltergeist activity. It's very, very common. I've experienced it ad nauseum. And this is going to sound like the Friedrich Jurgensen show, but I did a session a long time back with a mini box, I don't know, 6 years, something like that, 7 years back. And there was a thunderstorm outside. This was the middle of the day, and I was asking a question whether the storm makes communication easier. And at the same time, my voice was transfigured. That when I was speaking, the box was speaking, and it created a new communication. And that communication was actually Friedrich Jurgensen's voice, where it says, not bad. And right after that, another voice comes through and says, that's kind of Friedrich Jurgensen. And I was so blown away by this. I have a CD of Friedrich Jurgensen's EVPs. So I looked for like syllables, and I found one. He was speaking in German because he was Austrian by birth. And basically, I can't pronounce the exact word, but it's like Einstellung numeral 5 or something like that. But it has the N-O sound. So I was able to compare the N-O of what he was saying going into his EVP as he was introducing it versus the not bad that came through on my box. And I noticed that it sounded the same. And I looked that up because it says kind of Friedrich. So I thought that it might be Jurgensen. So I took it a step further, and I contacted the VTF in Germany, which is the longest standing EVP research group in the world. They started five years before Sarah Estep started AAEVP. And one of the founding members was Friedrich Jurgensen. And Friedrich just passed a few years ago. And a lot of the board members still knew him. And one of the board members that I reached out to, she's like, without a doubt, that's Friedrich Jurgensen's voice. And it only happened because my voice was transfigured in real time.
Wow.
That's crazy.
That's awesome. That's just and speaking of mediums, something you mentioned earlier, just so people know, on itcvoices.org, the book has been translated by Dr. Ernst Spakowski, and Tim has it on there in its entirety, like all 500 and some odd pages. But there's some interesting parts in there where mediums were, and it's all been transcribed for us, but there's actually one part where the original writing from a session is in there, but where they were predicting ITC communication back in the 30s. You'll have to correct me on some of this. I believe there's a few instances of it where they were actually talking about what was to come, and actually using machines and how it was going to be easier to communicate with the dead.
Yeah, and actually, let me pull up a quote here if I can. It's from Alice Bailey. And Alice Bailey was a theosophist. She was a medium. And let me see here. In 1936, she was also a channeler. And she was getting a lot of contacts with somebody who went by the name of Tibetan Master DK. And this quote, when I found it, just made my jaw drop. Within the next few years, the fact of the eternity of existence will have advanced from the realm of questioning into the realm of certainty. Through the use of radio by those who have passed over, will communication be set up and reduced to a true science. This was over 20 years before the first EVP was recorded. It was 23 years before the first EVP was recorded using radio.
Oh my God.
Wow.
That is way too exact and specific to really be debated. I mean, that's amazing. And I love when we get messages, that are like that, especially with all of the fraudulent people that give everything from what we do to mediumship to everything a bad name, when there are the absolute gifted individuals that obtain the frequencies to communicate and have that gift to share with the world. I think so much of it gets overlooked now because people have become so desensitized to the communication aspect. I talk about it all the time with EVP. I speak about when ghost hunters first went on the air, so to speak, and everybody and their brother and their cousins and their grandma, they all got an acronym name and, went out and started ghost hunting. It's, at the time when they would come up and they had an EVP, and the EVP, of course, they went through the explanation, EVP is blah, blah, blah. And they'd come up and it would be, and then they would talk about it, even if it was, even if it was a no, I would have friends calling me at 9:30 at night, going, oh my God, man, is that what you do? Did you see that? I'm sleeping with the lights on tonight. They're completely scared. Now you fast forward years later and, 15 years later, and we have people that will watch the same shows, but they need more and more to really, suffice, really get them what they need for their fix, because a sniffle or a whiff or a no is not going to do it. Whereas at one time it was the biggest thing ever. And I have to remind people, we are speaking with beings that are on the other side that are not here. And, so even if it just says, hi, it just said hi and we can't see it. So it by nature, that's, it's spectacular. And I guess that was more of a statement than anything, but
a little less of a question.
Yeah. It's one of the things that grinds my gears, to go with a little Family Guy. It really gets me. So a little bit more on the technical side with this question, Tim. Speaking of, okay, let's say most people have the out of the box SB7. Not everybody is going to be able to take the schematics and create a ghost box of their own, or be able to afford one of the nicer, models that somebody has put their heart and soul into. So just speaking for a novice, what would you suggest, like with frequency, with speed that you're setting up, say an SB7 for? Is there a prime range? Is there a more respected speed that you can set one up for, that, or something that you have noticed in your own, experiences gives you better results?
Well, you'll have to forgive me because I was gifted an SB7 by Gary Galka to review back in early 2010 before it was released on Halloween. And I only used it for about 2 weeks, and then it sat on a shelf and I gave it away. So the model that I had is not equivalent to the models that are out there today. But that being said, it depends on the time of day that you're using it, first of all. If you are using a ghost box during the daytime, I would recommend, AM or FM, whichever you receive better in your area. At night, you really have to be cautious when using AM because you have something that's called clear channel communication. A lot of AM channels go offline at night, so channels that have a large broadcast are able to buy bandwidth on either side of them during the nighttime hours. So you can get a lot of false positives where you can have a voice riding over several frequencies. And a lot of people don't know that. Any AM box used at night, and I can't remember the clear channel cutoff time. I think it's 11 o'clock. It might be 10 o'clock Eastern. Like Radio Disney, you'll be able to hear over several frequencies, for example. Coast to coast, you'll hear over several frequencies. That is just how it happens. So be careful using AM at night. And also, speed-wise, if you're using an SB7, it's pretty cut or dry. You can select different speeds. Now, the slower the speed that you use, the more of a chance you'll have of getting a false positive. False positives are where you will get multiple words from a radio broadcast. That happens when you use slow settings, like 3/4 of a second or 1 second, because you can utter 4 words in a second if you're talking at a rapid clip, which a lot of advertisements on radio do. So I always recommend using a faster setting, half second or lower. And what we are looking for is communication that comes through. Now, I've classified this communication over the years. There is fragmentative communication, which we will find typically on something like an SB7, where you will get a communication where it's multiple parts over an entire scan. So you'll get a word and then another word and then another word with time in between, and you parse those words together, and all of a sudden you have a complete phrase coming to you.
Right.
That's fragmentative. We also, sometimes you can get breakthrough, but it's rare on an SB7. It's more common in more analog systems because an SB7 is a digital tuner with artificial white noise. That's why it sounds like a train coming at you, because it's all artificial. A shack, for example, is not artificial white noise. So you're more likely to get a breakthrough communication, which is a communication that rides over everything. And it sounds like a voice-to-voice communication like we're having right now.
Right.
So always set it a little faster and just give it a listen. And most importantly, when you're doing these sessions, you don't have to go for 30 minutes, 40 minutes, 50 minutes. That's ridiculous. You can get the communication that you need in 5 minutes or less, typically.
Stacy just praised your name. It's I'm the 50-minute guy. I get so into it. And speaking of that, great segue, actually, Tim. This is something that's almost hard to put into words. And as I've said, there's been countless hours I have used the Shack Hack and the SB7 and really just gone into it, recording the sessions as I go. And then later, I'll be in a room by myself and really when I'm reviewing this stuff, I build this construct in my head of the room that I was in at the time and put myself back in that situation. And while I'm finding this communication, and I always end up finding so much more than I did real time. So my question really goes into first part of a statement is I have over the years discovered this underlying almost nonstop track that is, I want to be careful here not to sound like too much of a whack job, but it's almost as if there's another dimension, another realm that is a constant underneath of the regular white noise or the bands going by or the occasional radio station or even the topical answers of, yes or hello in 1929 or whatever. This person or people, a lot of times in several investigations, it was almost like it was the same thing. Maybe something that was with me, but was not the nicest thing in the world, was saying pretty hardcore things several times. And it was almost underneath of the top layer of what you're listening to the degree that I'd actually have to cut out the pieces to show them to somebody, because if they're just listening, they're not really getting what I'm talking about. And it was to such a degree that I kind of stepped away a little bit, and I didn't write some big blog and put it out there about what I was going through and how I was going to have to step away. It wasn't like that. I'm just saying I stepped away without saying it for a couple of months from doing the ITC. But have you ever encountered anything like that? The more that you've done it, or almost like this other nonstop type communication on the other side?
Absolutely. And I know what you're talking about. It can be one of the most infuriating things when you're listening and you catch something at just the surface level, but then you go back and you listen to a different frequency set and it's a different phrase entirely. And then there's something else under that. And you can have three communications layered on top of each other, but there's no way to separate them out and be able to demonstrate all that communication writing in just that 2-second clip. It is, it's one of those things. And people who are not experienced in this field just will not understand that. And people who are not avid listeners will not understand that. Me, when I do a session, for me to go back and review it, unless it's an investigation, I take at least a month before I listen back to the session. I don't try to reconstruct a room or anything like that. I want to get as far away from the session as possible. So when I come back with fresh ears. And I always listen via headphones, and I use Adobe Audition, and I will go through and I will transcribe syllable by syllable throughout the communication. That's why I say keep your communication small, your sessions small, because if you're using a Shack Hack or a Boutique Ghost Box, for every minute of audio that you are going through, it can take you upwards of 20 minutes to parse the communication if you're really digging in on it. So if you're recording 20 minutes, you've got several hours ahead of you. On a Shack Hack, not so much, because you only get communication on part of the band. It's really quick, easy to go through. But the more developed boxes, you will have to spend more time with, and you're going to find layered audio. And the consistency of it is quite amazing. There is communication that goes on all the time in the background. I call it the cafe effect, to where you're basically talking with a single entity or a group of entities, but in the background, they're just chattering away on other topics, just having communications in the background, spirit to spirit. And I call it the cafe effect because basically it's like sitting in a cafe and you're just eavesdropping on other conversations that are happening.
Right, absolutely. And that's funny because I've heard them commenting on me before. And, I've got some of my favorite ones that are cut out. Like I've got one where it's like, he's crazy. And it says, no, he cares.
I had one that called me a freak for several years.
Yeah.
And the others would.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
So, okay. Wow. I have, and it's again, several years, but I have so many of this one and it calling me a freak. And I've always played, I've got all these cut out, man. And I've played it for Stacy a million times. And it's always just like, he's a freak, or, it'll be something to that effect. And then I was
getting freaked from 09 to about 2011 until I moved to Michigan. I got freak all the time, every session I was doing. And I also had a gentleman who come through that would let me know when the communication was ready to start. It just said now. And when I read Radova years later, he had a voice that came through that told him now when the communication was ready to start.
That's awesome. Well, I will say this has been a very enjoyable interview. I could honestly go on for hours talking with you, because very rarely do you come across someone in this field who is so well read on a specific topic. And I believe the paranormal, the words of paranormal research, they encompass far too much to be able to be, I know we're always like, well, there's no expert. Well, there is in certain levels of being able to use certain devices correctly, and or as the quote that I started it with, people that have had more experiences. But you've not only done that, you have also done the research on who came before us, and with dates, with hard facts, with all of the great research that you have put together on the ITCvoices.org website. And, I just want to say I commend you on that. I respect your work, and I really appreciate what you've done for the field. I'd like to give you the last word here. If there was anything you would like to, to say, or anything that we didn't cover.
Yeah, well, thank you. Your words mean a lot to me. I know you've got a great place in the paranormal field, and I appreciate the recognition. And I didn't start out to get recognition. I just started out to try to quantify what I was experiencing in these sessions. But as for the last word, you can always find me on Facebook, my personal profile. I post very little paranormal stuff there. It's mainly just irreverent memes and videos. But you can follow Paranormal Study. You can follow ITC Voices, both of which are posting new content constantly via social media. And more importantly, I do a lot of lectures during the year. And there's this one series of lectures that I do called Autographs, which when we do one of these lectures, we bring in a bunch of people, and all the money that's generated goes directly to a local animal shelter. So please go to the Potographs for Pooch's Facebook page and look to see if we're coming to your area, because animals hold a big place in my heart, and I would love to meet some of you all and come out and actually see what ITC is like while helping out the critters.
I can't think of a better cause, honestly, that's near and dear to our hearts as well. And from what I hear, Tim loves questions on the Illuminati. So he gets some funny questions, and if you do follow him on social media, sometimes you will get to see some of these. I won't say absurd, because people have, questions about things, but he gets some interesting ones. Tim Woolworth, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to come and speak with us. And I invite everybody, if you want to really learn more, and this came because of people asking for more information on ITC, on ghost boxes. There's a lot of places you might be able to find things, but personally, ITCvoices.org, even paranormalstudy.com, you want to go there and really start immersing yourself into what came before, what is already established, what theories are out there, and that way you can start developing your own. Tim, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, John and Stacy. It's been fun.
All right. Well, that was pretty awesome.
That was great.
Yeah.
That was so interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That was one of the best guests. No offense to the other guest.
Right.
But that was one of the best guests that we've ever had, just because I enjoy talking to him.
Someone has to be the best.
Somebody has to be the best, right? So
That's right.
I hope everybody out there enjoyed our little sneak peek really into what the realm of shadows is. Mm-hmm. And that, of course, our Patreon show. And, give you a little bit, what the interview portion is like. Mm-hmm. But we also enjoyed this, and never fear, as promised, there are going to be 2 episodes back to back coming out. So you got your regular Paranormal Sideshow, and you have this little sneak peek. But we also wanted to do this because I mean, it was something that is near and dear to my heart. It's my favorite part of the research. So be sure to go to itcvoices.org and check out everything he's got on there, especially if you're just now getting into the paranormal and you really think that ITC research is the way you want to go or you're going to use it at all. You need to find out where it came from. You need to know as much as you possibly can and read other people's theories, and that helps you develop your own. But speaking of theories, you might want to go to paranormalsideshow.com, and that's where you can find a little bit of everything, and you can find the links to all of it as well. And Stacy always has some goodies on there, tells you about all the shows and all the links to all the stories, all that good stuff. And for my lovely wife, my name's John. So long from the Sideshow.
Good night.